Hang this up and fetch the champagne immediately. The service here is absolutely atrocious. That was the first thing my sister-in-law said to me after 20 years of silence. She threw her soaking wet trench coat directly into my face, not realizing she had just assaulted the owner of the mansion she was hoping to inherit. My mother Monique did not even look at me. She was too busy calculating how much my dead uncle's antique furniture would sell for. They thought they were walking into a massive payday. They had no idea they were walking into an eviction. My name is Jada, and at 32 years old I make a living determining the true value of things that people leave behind. As an asset liquidator in Chicago, I can look at a diamond ring and tell you if it was bought out of love or guilt. I can look at a balance sheet and tell you if a company is rotting from the inside. But nothing prepared me for the night my biological family stormed back into my life, expecting to strip the flesh off the bones of the only man who ever loved me. Before I tell you how I made them regret every single second of that night, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to protect you. The blizzard outside was battering the windows of the Kenwood estate, a historic limestone mansion that took up half the block. Inside it was dead silent. I stood in the center of the grand foyer wearing black slacks and a simple black turtleneck holding my iPad. I was running the final inventory list for the estate. Everything had a tag, everything had a price. The Ming Dynasty vase on the pedestal, the Persian rug that had seen 3 generations of footsteps, and me. I had been appraised and discarded by my family exactly 20 years ago. The heavy oak double doors burst open, letting in a swirl of snow and freezing wind. The silence shattered instantly. "Close the door, Trayvon, you are letting the heat out," a shrill voice screamed. My mother Monique stepped into the foyer first. She was dripping wet but still trying to look like royalty. She wore a fur coat that I knew was fake because I knew exactly which discount boutique in the suburbs she frequented. Behind her was my younger brother Trayvon. At 28, he still had the face of a spoiled child who had never been told no. He dragged 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases that were clearly knockoffs across the pristine marble floor, leaving muddy tracks of slush and salt. And then there was Paige, my brother's wife. The only white woman in the room, and the one who seemed to believe she owned the place the moment she stepped across the threshold. She shook her blonde hair, spraying water everywhere, and looked around with a sneer of judgment. Finally she sighed, locking eyes with me. She did not see a family member. She did not see a human being. She saw a servant. "Excuse me," she snapped, peeling off her heavy, waterlogged trench coat. "Are you deaf?" I said. "Hang this up." She balled up the coat and tossed it. It hit me square in the chest with a wet thud. The icy water seeped through my turtleneck instantly. I caught the bundle of fabric by reflex, the smell of damp wool and cheap perfume filling my nose. "God, the help in this city is so incompetent," Paige muttered, turning her back to me to inspect her makeup in the hallway mirror. "Make sure you dry that off before putting it in the closet. And bring us a bottle of Dom Perignon. I know Silas kept the good stuff in the cellar. We need to toast." I stood there frozen, not from the cold, but from the sheer audacity. My hands gripped her coat so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to throw it back. I wanted to scream that I was the one who paid the heating bill that was currently warming her skin. I wanted to tell her that the rug she was standing on with her muddy boots cost more than her entire life's earnings. But I didn't. I forced my muscles to relax. I took a breath. In my line of work, you learn that information is more valuable than reaction. If they thought I was the maid, I would let them think I was the maid. It would give me a front row seat to their greed. I placed the coat on the rack in the corner and picked up a silver tray. I made myself invisible. By the time I returned to the living room, Monique and Trayvon had already made themselves at home. Monique was running her hands over a bronze sculpture of a horse on the mantel, her eyes gleaming with a hunger that turned my stomach. "Trayvon, look at this," she whispered, tapping the metal with her long acrylic nails. "This is heavy. Solid bronze." I bet we can get at least 5,000 for it at the pawn shop downtown. 5,000, Trayvon scoffed, flopping onto the velvet sofa without taking off his wet jacket. That is nothing, Ma. I need at least 50,000 to book the studio time for my album. You promised me that once Uncle Silas kicked the bucket, we would have the cash. We will, baby, we will, Monique cooed, rushing over to adjust his collar, ignoring the fact that he was tracking mud onto a sofa I had just had professionally cleaned yesterday. Silas was a hoarder. Look at all this junk. We sell the furniture, we sell the art, and then we sell the house. You will be a star, Trayvon. Mama promised you. I stood in the shadows of the doorway, tray in hand. My heart hammered against my ribs. Uncle Silas had been dead for 3 days, and they had not shed a single tear. They were not here to mourn. They were here to feast. Trayvon kicked his feet up onto the coffee table. Good. Because Paige has been nagging me about her credit card bills. She says if we do not pay off her Sephora card, her credit score will drop below 600. Again. Paige walked in, then looking around the room with a critical eye. She picked up a crystal decanter, inspected the bottom, and put it back down with a loud clink. This place is a museum, she complained. It smells like old people. We are going to have to gut the whole thing. Tear down these walls, put in an open-concept kitchen. Maybe a skylight. I cannot live in a dungeon. I stepped forward, the ice in my veins spreading. Water. I asked, my voice low and flat. They all jumped. They had forgotten I was there. That is the thing about people like my family. They do not see the people who serve them. We are just furniture that moves. Oh, good you speak, Paige said, rolling her eyes. No, not water. Champagne. Are you slow? I told you specifically to get the champagne. We are celebrating. Celebrating what, ma'am? I asked, keeping my head lowered, staring at the mud on her boots. Celebrating our inheritance. Obviously, Paige laughed, gesturing to the grand room around her. My husband is the sole male heir. This is our house now, and frankly, I do not think we will be needing a full-time maid. We will probably let you go after the funeral, but for tonight, try to be useful. Monique turned to me then. For the first time, she actually looked at my face. She squinted, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. She took a step closer, tilting her head. Wait a minute, she muttered. I did not move. I looked her dead in the eye. I saw the recognition spark. I saw the memory of a 12-year-old girl crying at a bus stop 20 years ago. I saw the realization that the ghost she thought she had buried was standing in her living room holding a silver tray. You, Monique whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and disgust. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The only sound was the howling wind outside battering against the walls of the home they thought was theirs. Yes, ma'am, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Is there a problem with the service? I poured the vintage Dom Perignon into the crystal flutes with a steady hand. The bubbles fizzed and popped, the only sound in the room other than the crackling fire and the howling wind outside. I placed a glass in front of Trayvon, who did not even bother to look up from his phone. He was too busy adjusting a ring light he had set up on my antique coffee table, preparing to broadcast his grief to his 12,000 followers. Yo, girl, what is the Wi-Fi password? Trayvon barked, snapping his fingers in my direction without making eye contact. The signal in here is trash. I need to go live in 5 minutes. My fans need to see this. They need to see the legacy I just walked into. I stared at the top of his head. He was wearing a baseball cap indoors backwards. He was 28 years old, yet he spoke to me as if I were a vending machine that had swallowed his dollar. The password, I said, softly placing a coaster under his glass to protect the mahogany, is pay your debts. All one word. Capital P, capital Y, capital D. Trayvon stopped typing. He frowned, finally looking up at me with a confused expression. What kind of password is that? He muttered, shaking his head. Whatever, just make sure the router is reset. I cannot have this stream lagging when I do the house tour. He went back to his screen, dismissing me. I moved to Monique. She was already sipping her champagne, her eyes closed, humming with satisfaction. She looked like a cat that had just swallowed a canary. "This is the life," she whispered to no one in particular. I always knew Silas was sitting on a gold mine. Imagine hiding all this wealth while I was struggling to pay rent on that cramped apartment. Selfish, just purely selfish. I placed a napkin on her lap. She swatted my hand away. "I can do it myself," she snapped. "Just keep the bottle coming. And find me an ashtray. I want to smoke." "Ma'am, this is a non-smoking residence," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The smoke damages the art." Monique opened her eyes then. They were cold hard and filled with a lifetime of resentment. She looked at me with the same expression she used to wear when I was a child, and asked for a second helping of dinner. "Excuse me," she hissed, leaning forward. "Do you know who I am? I am the sister of the man who owned this house. I am the heir. If I want to smoke, I will smoke. If I want to burn this whole place down to the ground, I will do it. Do not tell me what to do in my own house. Go find an ashtray or I will ash on this rug." Before I could respond, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the foyer. It was a deep, authoritative sound that demanded attention. "That must be the lawyer," Paige said, clapping her hands together. "Finally. Let's get the paperwork over with so we can pop another bottle. Hey, you, get the door, and try to be faster this time." I set the champagne bottle down on the side table and walked to the entryway. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. This was it, the moment the curtain would be pulled back. I pulled open the heavy oak door. A gust of snow blew in, followed by a tall, elderly man in an impeccable charcoal wool coat. He carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 1,000 courtrooms. It was Mr. Sterling, Uncle Silas's attorney and closest friend. He shook the snow from his shoulders and looked at me. His stern face softened instantly. "Good evening, Ms. Jada," he said, his voice warm and respectful. He did not treat me like a servant. He treated me like the woman who had sat by Silas's bedside for 3 weeks while he took his final breaths. "I trust you are holding up well under the circumstances," he continued, stepping inside and handing me his hat. "I am managing, Mr. Sterling," I replied loud enough for the voices in the living room to carry. "Please come in. They are waiting for you." We walked into the living room together. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The casual arrogance that had filled the space evaporated, replaced by a sudden tense silence. Trevon lowered his phone. Paige sat up straighter, smoothing her skirt. Monique put down her glass. They were looking at Mr. Sterling, but then their eyes drifted to me. They were confused. Why was this distinguished lawyer speaking to the maid with such familiarity? Why did he call her Ms. Jada? Mr. Sterling stood in the center of the room and cleared his throat. "Good evening, everyone," he said, clutching his briefcase. "I apologize for the delay. The roads are treacherous tonight. But I see that Ms. Jada has already made you comfortable." He gestured to me with an open hand, a gesture of deference. The room went dead silent. You could hear the wind rattling the window panes. Monique stood up slowly. Her movements were jagged, unlike the smooth arrogance she had displayed moments ago. She took a step toward me, her eyes narrowing behind her designer frames. She was not looking at my face. She was looking at my hand, specifically at the back of my right hand, where a jagged white scar ran from my knuckles to my wrist. It was a souvenir from my 12th birthday, the day my father had come home drunk and angry, and I had raised my hand to protect my face from a flying glass bottle. The bottle had shattered against my skin. Monique had been there. She had watched it happen. And instead of taking me to the hospital, she had wrapped it in a dirty towel and told me to stop crying because I was ruining the mood. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was like a vice. Her fingernails dug into my skin, bringing back a flood of memories I thought I had purged. She stared at the scar. Then she looked up at my face. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her mouth fell open, and for a second I saw fear. But it was quickly replaced by rage. "You," she whispered. The word hung in the air like a curse. Trayvon stood up, looking between us. "Ma, what is going on? Do you know the help?" "She is not the help," Monique spat, shoving my hand away as if I were contagious. She wiped her hand on her dress. Look at her, Trayvon. Look at her face. It is Jada. Trayvon squinted. Jada. You mean my sister Jada, the one who ran away? I did not run away, I said, my voice steady, though my insides were trembling. You left me at a Greyhound bus station with $10 and a bag of chips. You told me to wait for you. I waited for 3 days. Monique's face twisted. She did not look ashamed. She looked inconvenienced. I thought you were dead, she screamed, her voice cracking. I thought you died in the streets years ago. What are you doing here? Did you know Silas was dying? Did you crawl back here to beg? Paige let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She stood up and walked over to me, looking me up and down with renewed disgust. Oh, this is rich, Paige sneered. So this is the long-lost sister, the black sheep. I have heard the stories, the problem child, the one who brought bad luck to the family. She circled me, acting as if she were inspecting a piece of livestock. Let me guess. Paige continued, folding her arms over her chest. You heard the wealthy uncle died and you came sniffing around for a payout. You probably charmed your way into the house staff so you could steal some silverware before we arrived. Is that it? Are you here to ask for a handout? Because let me be clear, sweetheart. The will is about to be read, and I doubt Uncle Silas left anything to the niece who abandoned the family for 20 years. I looked at Paige. I looked at the diamond stud earrings she was wearing. I knew they were cubic zirconia. I looked at her bag. It was a knockoff from Canal Street. Everything about her was a facade. I am not here for a handout, Paige, I said quietly. And I did not abandon anyone. I was erased. Monique stepped in front of me, blocking my view of the others. She was shorter than me now, but she still tried to loom over me. Do not play the victim with me, Jada, Monique hissed. Sending you away was the best thing I ever did. Look at us. Trayvon is an artist. I am comfortable. We survived without you. We thrived without your bad energy. And now that we are finally getting what we deserve, you show up like a ghost to haunt us. Well, it won't work. She turned to Mr. Sterling, pointing a shaking finger at me. Get her out of here. I want her gone. If this is my house, I have the right to choose who is inside it. And I do not want this mistake. Breathing my air. Mr. Sterling did not move. He did not blink. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at Monique with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. Mrs. Monique, I am afraid you are jumping to conclusions, Mr. Sterling said calmly. We have not even begun the reading of the last will and testament. And as for Ms. Jada's presence here, I cut him off with a subtle raise of my hand. I did not want him to reveal everything yet. I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to see the depth of their greed before I buried them in it. I am staying, I said. Uncle Silas asked me to be here. Trayvon laughed, a loud barking sound. Silas asked you? Yeah, right. The man was probably senile. Look, Jada, or whatever you call yourself now. Take a hint. Nobody wants you here. You are ruining the vibe. I'm about to be a millionaire. I don't need my charity case sister hanging around looking like a depressing funeral director. He pulled out his wallet and threw a crumpled $20 bill at me. It hit my chest and fluttered to the floor, landing next to his muddy boots. Here, Trayvon said, smirking. Go buy yourself a bus ticket back to wherever you came from. Consider it a family reunion gift. I looked down at the money, then I looked at Mr. Sterling. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. It was time to begin the show. Shall we sit down? I asked, ignoring the money on the floor. The reading needs to begin. Monique glared at me for a long moment, her chest heaving. Finally, she scoffed and turned back to the sofa. Fine, she muttered. Stay. Watch us get everything. Watch us get the life you were never good enough to have. But do not expect a single penny, Jada. Not 1 cent. I watched them sit down, arranging themselves on the furniture like they were royalty. They had no idea that the chair Monique was sitting on was a reproduction I had bought at an estate sale for $200. They had no idea that the real value in this room was standing right in front of them holding an iPad. I walked over to the corner and stood quietly. Mr. Sterling sat in the high-backed armchair, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a thick document sealed with wax. The sound of the paper rustling was sharp and loud. Trayvon leaned forward, his eyes greedy. Paige licked her lips. Monique held her breath. I just watched, and I waited. The silence in the room shattered as Monique finally found her voice. It started as a low disbelief-filled chuckle and quickly escalated into a full-blown hysterical laugh. She threw her head back, the movement causing her gold hoop earrings to dance against her neck. It was a sound I remembered from my childhood. It was the sound she made right before she decided someone was going to pay for her unhappiness. "You have some nerve!" Jada Monique said, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye, though her expression was devoid of any real humor. "You really do. You stand there in your little black outfit, holding a tray like a servant, and you expect us to believe that Silas wanted you here. Silas barely tolerated you when you were a child. He only took you in because I begged him to, because I was too kind-hearted to let you go to foster care after you ruined our lives." I felt Mr. Sterling shift in his seat, ready to defend me, but I held up a hand to stop him. I needed to hear this. I needed to let them empty their ammunition before I fired a single shot. "I did not ruin your life, Monique," I said, my voice cutting through her laughter like a blade of ice. "I was 12 years old. I was a child who needed a mother. Instead, you packed my clothes in a garbage bag and drove me to the Greyhound station in the middle of a thunderstorm." Trayvon slammed his hand down on the coffee table, making the champagne flutes jump. "Stop rewriting history, Jada," he shouted, his face turning red. "You were a curse. Everyone knew it. We went to that spiritual advisor, Madame Cleo, and she told us the truth. She said your aura was black. She said you were blocking my blessings. And she was right." He stood up and pointed a shaking finger at me. "The week after you left, I finally made the varsity basketball team." Trayvon continued, his voice thick with misplaced conviction. "I was going to the NBA. I had scouts looking at me. But the moment you started calling the house trying to beg your way back in, I blew out my knee. That was you. That was your negative energy reaching back to drag me down." I looked at my brother. I looked at the man who was blaming a 12-year-old girl for his lack of discipline and athletic ability. I remembered that knee injury. I remembered reading about it in the papers years later. He had been drunk driving and crashed his car into a telephone pole, but in the mythology of this family, I was the villain. I was the convenient excuse for every failure. "So that is the story you tell yourself?" I asked quietly. "That I used voodoo to ruin your basketball career from 3 states away?" "You were drunk, Trayvon. You were always drunk. Don't you dare talk about my son like that," Monique screeched, stepping forward again. She looked like a cornered animal. "Trayvon is a star. He is a sensitive soul. And you were always a burden. Do you know how much money we saved on groceries after you left? Do you know how peaceful the house was without you moping around in corners reading your stupid books?" She took a breath, puffing out her chest. "And don't act like I threw you out with nothing," she spat. "I gave you money. I gave you 10 whole dollars. Do you know what $10 could buy back then? A lot. I could have bought a pack of cigarettes and a lottery ticket. Instead, I gave it to you. That was more than enough for a bus ticket to wherever. I was generous. I was a saint. And this is how you repay me, by sneaking back into my brother's house to steal my inheritance." Paige stood up now, sensing that the momentum was shifting. She crossed her arms, trying to look authoritative, like a lawyer she had seen on television. "Okay, that is enough," Paige announced, her voice shrill. "We do not need to listen to this. In the state of Illinois, if you have been estranged for more than 7 years, you have no legal standing to contest a will. I read that online. You are basically a trespasser at this point." She turned to Mr. Sterling, flashing a fake tight smile. "Mr. Sterling, as the future lady of this house, I am instructing you to remove this woman. If she does not leave voluntarily, we will call the police. I am sure they would be very interested to know that a disgruntled relative is harassing the grieving family, Mr. Sterling looked at Paige over the rim of his spectacles. He looked like he was watching a toddler try to explain nuclear physics. Mrs. Page, he began slowly. I would strongly advise against involving law enforcement. The situation regarding the property is complex. It is not complex, Monique yelled, losing her patience entirely. It is simple. I am the sister. Trayvon is the nephew. Jada is the mistake. We want her gone. She lunged at me then. It happened fast, but to me it felt like slow motion. For 20 years I had replayed the moments of my childhood, where I had cowered, where I had flinched, where I had let her hit me because I thought I deserved it. But I was not 12 years old anymore, and I was not cowering. Monique raised her hand, her palm open, aiming for my face. It was the same motion she had used 1,000 times before. But this time, before her hand could make contact with my skin, I moved. My hand shot up and caught her wrist. I didn't squeeze hard, just enough to stop her momentum cold. The sound of skin hitting skin echoed in the silent room. Monique gasped. Her eyes widened in shock. She tried to pull her hand back, but I held it firm. She pulled harder, struggling, but I didn't budge. I was stronger than her now, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. I looked down at her. I saw the wrinkles around her eyes, the fear behind her anger, the pathetic desperation of a woman who had never taken responsibility for a single thing in her life. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, her voice trembling. "Trayvon! Help me! She is assaulting me!" Trayvon took a step forward, but the look I gave him froze him in his tracks. It was a look that promised consequences. A look that said I knew every secret, every failure, and every lie he had ever told. He sank back onto the sofa, proving once again that his bravery was nothing but a facade. I turned my attention back to Monique. I brought my face close to hers, so close I could smell the stale smoke and cheap mints on her breath. "Do not ever touch me again," I whispered. My voice was low, devoid of emotion, terrifyingly calm. "Those days are over. You lost the right to discipline me the moment you left me on that bench in the rain." I released her wrist with a sharp shove. She stumbled back, clutching her hand to her chest, looking at me as if I were a monster. "You are unnatural," she hissed, backing away until she hit the edge of the table. "Silas should have left you on the street." I straightened my jacket, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. "You should listen to your daughter-in-law, Monique," I said, looking her up and down with pity. "She likes to talk about the law. Well, here is a piece of advice. You are going to need all your energy. Do not waste it on hitting me. Save your strength for counting the money. Because looking at you now, I think you are going to be very, very tired by the end of this night." Trayvon laughed nervously from the couch. "Yeah, that is right," he said, trying to regain his bravado. "We are going to be counting millions. And you are going to be watching from the sidewalk." I looked at the clock on the mantel. The storm outside was intensifying, rattling the heavy window panes. The stage was set. The players were in position. They were so confident, so arrogant, so blissfully unaware that they were standing on a trapdoor. "Mr. Sterling," I said, turning to the lawyer, "I believe my family is ready. Please proceed with the reading of the will. Let's give them exactly what they deserve." Mr. Sterling nodded solemnly. He broke the wax seal on the envelope. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Monique sat down, rubbing her wrist, her eyes fixed greedily on the paper. Paige leaned forward, practically salivating. Trayvon adjusted his camera angle. They thought the war was over. They had no idea it had not even begun. The atmosphere in the room shifted the moment Mr. Sterling adjusted his spectacles. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of anticipation. I stood with my back against the cold wainscoting near the door, blending into the shadows, while my family occupied the center of the room. They sat on the Italian leather sofas I had selected for Uncle Silas 5 years ago, looking for all the world like royalty waiting to be crowned. Monique was literally vibrating. She gripped Traven's hand so hard her knuckles were white. Traven was bouncing his leg, a nervous tic he had never outgrown. Paige sat with her chin high, already surveying the room, as if planning which walls to knock down first. They were a portrait of entitlement. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. It was a dry, dusty sound that demanded absolute silence. He held the document up to the light, the thick cream-colored paper trembling slightly in his aged hands. I, Silas Benjamin, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament. Mr. Sterling began, his voice baritone and steady. Monique let out a small, strangled squeak. Paige shushed her aggressively. To my estranged niece, Jada, Mr. Sterling read, pausing to look over his glasses at me. The heads of the trio on the couch snapped toward me. Their eyes were wide, predatory. They were ready to pounce, ready to contest whatever scraps Silas might have thrown my way. I leave my collection of vintage jazz vinyl records and the advice that she continues to walk her own path, for she was the only one who ever truly understood the value of silence. Trevon snorted. Old records. That is it, man. Uncle Silas really hated you? Monique relaxed, a smug smile spreading across her face. Good. That is exactly what she deserves. Trash for trash. Mr. Sterling waited for them to quiet down before continuing. The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. This was the main event. And now, regarding the residency and contents of the estate at 45 Kenwood Avenue. Mr. Sterling read. I watched them closely. This was the trap. I had worked with Mr. Sterling on the specific wording of this clause for days. It had to be legally accurate, yet specifically designed to feed their ego while blinding them to the reality. I hereby bequeath full rights of usage control and tenancy of the property known as the Kenwood Estate, along with all furniture, art, and physical assets contained within these walls, to my sister Monique and my nephew Trayvon. For a split second there was silence as their brains processed the complex legal phrasing. They heard the words usage and control and translated them immediately into ownership and wealth. Then the dam broke. Yes, Monique screamed, leaping off the couch with the agility of a woman half her age. She threw her hands in the air, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Silas. I knew it. I knew you wouldn't let me down. She grabbed Traven and pulled him into a suffocating hug. We are rich, baby. We made it. Mama told you. Mama told you we would get ours. Traven was laughing, a loud, obnoxious sound of relief. He pumped his fist in the air. Let's go. That is what I am talking about. No more rent, no more evictions. We run the city now. But it was Paige who reacted with the most terrifying speed. Before Mr. Sterling could even fold the paper, she had her phone out. She jumped up, positioned herself in front of the grand fireplace, and hit record. Hey guys! She shouted at her screen, putting on a fake bright influencer voice that made my skin crawl. So big news. Huge news. We just got the official word. We are now the proud owners of a historic mansion in Kenwood. Look at this place. She spun around, panning the camera across the room, capturing the crystal chandelier, the oil paintings, and briefly her husband and mother-in-law celebrating. She pointedly avoided panning the camera toward me. Started from the bottom. Now we are here, Paige chirped. Bye-bye, apartment life. Hello, luxury. I told you guys big things were coming. Stay tuned for the house tour. She ended the video and immediately began typing a caption, her thumbs flying across the screen. I stood there stone-faced. I felt a strange mixture of pity and disgust. They were celebrating their own execution. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, convinced they were standing on a mountain. They had heard what they wanted to hear. They ignored the word tenancy. They ignored the absence of the word deed. They saw the glitter, but they missed the hook. Trayvon broke away from his mother and walked toward me. His strut was different now. It was heavier, arrogant. He walked like a man who thought the ground beneath his feet belonged to him. He stopped inches from my face, invading my personal space, smelling of sweat and cheap cologne. Did you hear that he asked, his voice low and mocking? Did you hear the man full control? That means I am the boss. That means I say who stays and who goes. He poked me in the shoulder with a hard, stiff finger. And you? You are a guest, and a bad one at that. You are bad vibes, Jada. You are a dark cloud in our sunny day. So here is my first executive order as the master of this house. He pointed to the heavy oak door. Get out. Monique looked up from her celebration, her eyes gleaming with malice. You heard him? She chimed in. Get out of our house. Take your little records if you want, but leave the silver tray. And the iPad, that belongs to us now. Paige looked up from her phone, smirking. You should probably leave before the snow gets worse, she added dismissively. Although I don't really care if you freeze. Just don't freeze on our driveway. It would be bad for property values. I looked at each of them in turn. I etched this moment into my memory. I wanted to remember exactly how they looked when they thought they had won. I wanted to remember the cruelty in their eyes, the absolute lack of grace or humility. I looked at Mr. Sterling. He was sitting perfectly still, his face impassive, though I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. He was waiting for my signal. Not yet, I thought. Let them climb higher. The fall needs to break them. I adjusted my coat. I did not step back. I did not look down. I will leave, I said softly. But not before you sign the paperwork. Trevon laughed. Paperwork? You want us to sign autographs? Mr. Sterling stood up then. His voice cut through their celebration like a gavel. Ms. Jada is correct, he said sternly. You have heard the bequeathal. But to legally claim the rights to the estate and its contents, you must sign the acceptance of asset responsibility. It is standard procedure. Without your signatures, the state will put the assets into probate, and you will not see a dime or a key for 18 months. The threat of delay worked instantly. The joy on Monique's face faltered for a second. 18 months, she stammered. No, no, no. We need this now. Where do we sign? Mr. Sterling opened his briefcase again and pulled out a thick binder. He laid it on the heavy oak coffee table with a thud. Right here, he said, producing a gold fountain pen. Trevon snatched the pen. Show me where. I will sign anything. I want my house. I watched them crowd around the table. They looked like vultures descending on a carcass. They didn't read a single line. They didn't ask a single question. They just saw the dollar signs dancing in their eyes. I took a deep breath. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all I had to do was wait for the snap. The ink on the acceptance forms was barely dry before the vultures began to pick the carcass clean. The solemnity of the lawyer's presence vanished, replaced by a chaotic energy that made the air in the room feel thin and frantic. I stood by the fireplace watching my family dismantle the sanctity of Uncle Silas's home with their words before they had even lifted a hammer. Trevon was the first to stake his claim. He marched over to the heavy double doors on the north side of the living room, the ones that led to Uncle Silas's private study. That room was a sanctuary. It smelled of pipe tobacco, old leather, and the hundreds of books Silas had read and reread over his lifetime. It was where he had taught me how to read a balance sheet, how to play chess, and how to value myself when the world told me I was worthless. Trevon kicked the door open. He stood in the threshold looking around with a sneer of disgust that quickly morphed into greedy calculation. Yo, this room is perfect, Trevon shouted, his voice echoing off the floor to ceiling bookshelves. Look at the acoustics in here. Ma, come look at this. Monique waddled over, her champagne glass still in hand, sloshing liquid onto the hardwood. What is it, baby? She asked, peering inside. It is dark. And it smells like old men. We need to rip these curtains down immediately. No, listen to the echo, Trevon said, clapping his hands loudly. I am going to gut this whole room. I'm going to rip out all these dusty old bookshelves. We can put soundproof foam on the walls, set up a vocal booth in the corner, and put the mixing board right where that big ugly desk is. This is going to be my studio, the Kenwood Records HQ. My stomach churned. He wanted to tear down the shelves that held first editions of Baldwin and Hemingway to put up cheap foam and record auto-tuned rap songs that no one would ever listen to. He wanted to burn the legacy of a man who had actually built something just to chase a fantasy he had been failing at for a decade. "You cannot tear out the shelves," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through their noise. "They are built into the structure of the house. They are black walnut. They are worth more than your car." Trayvon spun around, his eyes wild. "I can do whatever I want," he spat. "Didn't you hear the lawyer? Full control? That means if I want to turn this room into a swimming pool, I can. And who are you to tell me about value? You are just the girl who didn't get picked." He walked over to the nearest shelf, grabbed a leather-bound book at random, and tossed it onto the floor. The cover cracked. The sound hit me like a physical blow. "Trash," Trayvon muttered. "All of it is trash. We are clearing this out tomorrow." Paige, meanwhile, had been pacing around the coffee table, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was not interested in the decor. She was interested in security. She had been watching too many courtroom dramas and true crime documentaries, and she fancied herself a legal scholar. "Wait," she said, holding up a hand to stop the celebration. "We have a problem." Monique froze. "What problem?" "We signed the papers. Mr. Sterling said it is ours." "Yes, but she is still here," Paige said, pointing a manicured finger at me. "And as long as she is here, she is a liability. What if she claims squatters' rights? What if she trips on the stairs and sues us? What if she comes back in 6 months claiming Uncle Silas promised her a painting verbally? We need to close the loop. We need to make this bulletproof." Paige grabbed a piece of stationery from her purse. It was a crumpled piece of paper with a list of makeup products on the back. She flipped it over and clicked her pen with an aggressive snap. "I am going to draft a waiver," Paige announced, sitting down at the coffee table and writing furiously. "A quitclaim agreement. It basically says that Jada acknowledges she has received nothing, deserves nothing, and will never ask for anything in the future. Once she signs this, she is legally dead to this estate." I watched her write. Her handwriting was jagged and hurried. She was using big words she didn't fully understand, misusing legal jargon she had probably heard on a TV show. It was pathetic. It was laughable. But to them, it was the final nail in my coffin. She finished writing and slapped the paper down on the table. "Sign it," Paige commanded, looking up at me with a triumphant smirk. I walked slowly toward the table. Mr. Sterling watched me. He did not intervene. He knew the plan. He knew that the more they forced me to sign, the deeper they dug their own graves. I looked down at the paper. It was barely legible. "I, Jada Benjamin, hereby forfeit all claims to the Kenwood property and agree to vacate the premises immediately, leaving all assets behind." I looked up at them. Monique was watching me with a look of pure malice. Trayvon was leaning against the doorframe of the study he planned to destroy, looking bored. Paige was tapping her foot, impatient for her victory. I decided to give them one last chance to show a shred of humanity. One last chance to prove they were not complete monsters. I let my shoulders slump. I let my hands tremble slightly as I reached for the pen. I made my voice sound small, broken. "If I sign this," I whispered, looking directly at my mother. "If I sign this and walk away, will you let me go in peace? Will you stop sending me hateful messages? Will you just let me live my life?" Monique laughed. It was a dry, cruel sound. "We never stopped you from living your life, Jada," she said. "We just didn't want you messing up ours. You were always so dramatic. Always the victim. Just sign the paper and get out of my sight." I hesitated, holding the pen over the paper. "It is snowing hard outside," I said softly. "I didn't bring a coat. My car is parked 3 blocks away because the driveway was full. Can I at least wait until the storm passes?" Paige rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, she is pathetic. No, you cannot wait. We are having a private celebration. We don't want you lurking in the corner like a bad omen." Monique sighed, shaking her head as if my request for basic shelter was an imposition on her soul. Fine, Monique said, waving her hand dismissively. Sign the paper, and I will give you something. I think there is an old wool coat in the hall closet, the one I left here 5 years ago because it smelled like mothballs. You can have that. Consider it your inheritance. She smiled then. A smile that was supposed to be benevolent, but was actually the cruelest thing she had done all night. See, I am generous, Monique added. I am a good mother. I am giving you the clothes off my back. Now, sign. The coat she was talking about was a ratty gray thing she had bought at a thrift store in the 90s. She was offering me her garbage in exchange for my birthright. That was it. That was the final straw. The last thread of hesitation snapped inside me. I looked at the paper. I looked at the pen. Okay, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I will sign. I bent down. I pressed the pen to the paper. I felt the eyes of everyone in the room on my hand. They were holding their breath. They thought this signature was the key to their kingdom. They thought this piece of paper was their shield. I signed my name, Jada Benjamin. I added a flourish at the end, a sharp line that cut through the paper slightly. I stood up and handed the paper to Paige. She snatched it from my hand as if it were a winning lottery ticket. Done, Paige announced, waving the paper in the air. It is done. She has no claim. The house is ours. The money is ours. Everything is ours. Trayvon let out a whoop of joy. Monique clapped her hands. They began to high-five each other, their laughter filling the room, drowning out the sound of the wind outside. I took a step back, moving toward the shadow where Mr. Sterling sat. He was closing his briefcase, his face unreadable to them, but clear to me. I caught his eye, just for a second. I winked. It was a small movement, imperceptible to the family celebrating their victory. But to Mr. Sterling it was the signal. It was the command. He gave me a microscopic nod. He cleared his throat again, louder this time. Excuse me, Mr. Sterling said, his voice booming across the room. The celebration faltered. Monique turned around annoyed. What is it now? She asked. We signed the papers. She signed the waiver. Can't you just leave us alone to enjoy our house? Mr. Sterling stood up. He did not look like a tired old man anymore. He looked like an executioner. I am afraid there is one more document we need to review, he said, pulling a red folder from his briefcase. This is the addendum to the asset schedule. It concerns the liquidity of the estate. Liquidity? Trayvon asked, frowning. You mean the cash? Precisely, Mr. Sterling said. You have signed the acceptance of the assets. Now we must verify the value of those assets, specifically the bank accounts. Monique's eyes lit up again. Oh, finally. The money. Read it. How much is it? 2,000,003. I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. I felt the ghost of a smile playing on my lips. The code offer had been a mistake, Monique. A very big mistake. Read it, Mr. Sterling. I said, my voice strong, no longer trembling. Tell them what they won. The room was thick with the smell of cheap perfume and expensive champagne. My family was already mentally redecorating the mansion, spending money they did not yet have, and erasing the memory of the man who had built it all. I stood in the corner, clutching the moth-eaten wool coat Monique had graciously allowed me to have, watching them celebrate their victory over a woman they thought was defeated. Mr. Sterling did not share in their joy. He moved with the slow, deliberate gravity of a funeral director closing a casket. He reached into his leather briefcase one last time and pulled out a binder. It was not a thin envelope like the will. It was a heavy, thick stack of legal documents bound in black leather. He placed it on the coffee table with a resounding thud that rattled the empty crystal glasses. This is the final step, Mr. Sterling announced, his voice cutting through their laughter. To formally transfer the title and the contents of the Kenwood estate, the beneficiaries must sign the affidavit of assumption. Paige let out a dramatic groan, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. Oh my God, seriously? Paige complained, refilling her glass until the foam spilled over onto the table. How much paperwork does it take to get a house? This is ridiculous. In the time it has taken you to shuffle papers, I could have listed this place on Zillow. It is a necessary formality, Mrs. Page, Mr. Sterling said, his eyes cold behind his wire-rimmed glasses. This document confirms that you, Monique, and Trayvon accept not just the physical keys, but the entirety of the estate's legal standing. It merges your assets with the estate's assets. Monique waved her hand dismissively, the diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the light. We know, Monique said, her voice slurring slightly from the alcohol. We take the house, we take the furniture, we take the money. Just open it to the signature page so we can get this over with. I am starving, and I want to order lobster. Mr. Sterling looked at me. It was a fleeting glance, barely a flicker of his eyelids, but I read the message clearly. This was the point of no return. Once the ink touched that paper, the trap would snap shut, and there would be no way to pry it open. I felt a sudden strange pang in my chest. Not pity exactly. Perhaps it was just the last remnant of the little girl who used to wait by the window for her mother to come home. I had to give them one last chance. I had to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that their greed was absolute. Wait, I said. My voice was not loud, but it stopped Trayvon just as he was reaching for the gold fountain pen. He froze and looked up at me, his face twisting into a sneer. What now? Trayvon snapped. Did you forget your gloves? Do you want a hat to go with that ugly coat? I took a step forward, ignoring his insults. I looked directly at my mother. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, who had discarded me, and who was now sitting on my sofa eager to erase me completely. Read the document, Monique, I said softly. Monique scoffed, leaning back into the cushions. Why would I do that? I have a lawyer right here. I am not talking about him, I said. I am talking to you. You are signing away your life on a piece of paper you haven't even glanced at. Are you sure you want to do this? Paige slammed her glass down on the table. Oh, listen to her, Paige jeered. She is trying to scare us. She is jealous, Monique. She knows that once you sign that she can never come back here. She is trying to stall. I ignored Paige. I kept my eyes locked on my brother and mother. I am asking you a question, I said, making my voice hard and clear. Are you sure you want to accept absolutely everything Uncle Silas left behind? Trayvon stood up, puffed out his chest, and walked toward me. He invaded my personal space, looming over me with the arrogance of a man who believes he has already won the lottery. What is your problem? Jada Trayvon asked. You think you are smart? You think you know something we don't? I think you are rushing, I replied calmly. Uncle Silas was a complicated man. His estate is heavy. Are you sure you want to carry it? Are you sure you want everything? Even the things you cannot see? Trayvon laughed right in my face. The smell of stale champagne was overwhelming. I want it all, he declared, spreading his arms wide. I want the house, I want the cars, I want the bank accounts, I want the dust in the attic, I want the dirt in the garden. He leaned in closer, his eyes manic. I will take the bacteria on the toilet seat if it means it belongs to me and not you, Jada. I will take every single atom in this house, because it is mine. It is my birthright. And you get nothing. He turned back to the table, snatched the pen from Mr. Sterling's hand, and bent over the document. Monique cheered him on. That is my boy. Show her sign it. Trayvon, sign it. Big. Trayvon scrawled his signature across the line with aggressive sweeping loops. He pressed down so hard the nib of the pen almost tore through the paper. He finished with a violent dot on the I and threw the pen down on the document. There he shouted, Done. I own it. Monique was next. She didn't even pretend to look at the text. She just wanted to put her name next to the money. She grabbed the pen and signed her name with a flourish, adding a little heart over the I in Monique. It was grotesque. Naomi Page said, reaching for the pen. Mr. Sterling pulled the binder away slightly. Actually, Mrs. Page, he said politely. You are not a blood relative, and you are not named in the will. Your signature is not required. The the responsibility, falls solely on your husband and your mother-in-law. Page looked offended for a second, but then she shrugged. Whatever she said. What is theirs is mine anyway. We are a team. Just give me the keys. Mr. Sterling did not give her the keys. Instead, he carefully closed the binder. He aligned the edges. He clicked the 3 metal rings shut. The sound echoed in the room like a prison cell door slamming home. He looked at the signatures one last time, verifying them. Then he looked up at Monique and Trevon. His expression changed. The deferential, polite lawyer vanished. In his place sat a man who was done playing games. "Thank you," Mr. Sterling said, his voice flat. "The transfer is complete. The estate of Silas Benjamin, including all its assets and all its encumbrances, is now legally the property of Monique and Trevon Benjamin." "Income what?" Trevon asked, frowning. "What does that word mean?" "It means you got the house, baby," Monique shouted, clapping her hands. "Who cares what he calls it? We are rich." She reached for the bottle of Dom Perignon to pour another round, but she found it empty. "Jada," Monique yelled, not even looking at me, "go down to the cellar and get another bottle. Now that we have signed, you can be useful one last time before you leave." I did not move. I stayed where I was, leaning against the wall, the ghost of a smile finally touching my lips. "No," I said. The room went silent. Monique turned slowly, her face twisting into a mask of fury. "Excuse me," she hissed. "What did you say to me?" I said no. I repeated, my voice rising in volume, filling the room. "I will not get you champagne, I will not hang up your coat, and I will definitely not be leaving just yet." Paige stood up, her face red. "Listen here, you little squatter," Paige shrieked. "You saw them sign the papers. This is their house. If you do not do what we say, we are calling the police." "Call them," I said, pushing myself off the wall and walking toward the center of the room. "Please, call the police. I would love for them to be here for the next part." Trevon stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You are pushing your luck, Jada. Get out, now." I looked at Mr. Sterling. He nodded. He opened his briefcase again. But this time he didn't pull out a will. He didn't pull out a deed. He pulled out a red folder. It was the color of a warning sign. It was the color of debt. Trevon stopped moving. He looked at the red folder, then at me. For the first time all night, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "What is that?" Trevon asked, his voice shaking slightly. Mr. Sterling opened the folder. "You wanted everything, Trevon," I said, my voice cold as the winter wind outside. "You said you wanted every atom. You said you wanted the bacteria." I took a step closer to him. "Well, congratulations, little brother. You also got the bills." Mr. Sterling cleared his throat. "Now that the transfer of ownership is legally binding," he said, looking at the horrified faces on the couch, "we must proceed to the immediate settlement of the estate's financial standing. We need to discuss the debts." "Debts?" Monique whispered, the color draining from her face. "What debts?" Silas was rich. He had this house. Mr. Sterling looked at her over his glasses. "Mr. Silas Benjamin had not held the title to this property for 10 years, Mrs. Monique. He was a tenant. And as of this moment, so are you." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolutely delicious. The scratching sound of the pen hitting the paper was still echoing in my ears when Mr. Sterling flipped the page of the binder with a deliberate, heavy hand. The air in the room was thick with greed. You could practically smell it coming off my family, mixing with the scent of wet wool and expensive perfume. They were already spending the money in their heads. I could see it in their eyes. Monique was envisioning a cruise to the Mediterranean. Trevon was picturing a custom recording studio with neon lights. Paige was mentally redesigning the kitchen with Italian marble. Now that the asset assumption is signed and legally binding, Mr. Sterling said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we must proceed to the liquidity schedule. This details the immediate cash assets available in Mr. Silas Benjamin's personal accounts." Monique rubbed her hands together. The sound was like dry leaves scraping against pavement. Finally, she breathed out, leaning forward until her nose was almost touching the binder. Read it out, Mr. Sterling, and do not be shy with the zeros. I know Silas. He was cheap. He never bought anything nice for himself. He wore the same coat for 10 years. That man sat on every penny he ever earned. There has to be millions in there. Trayvon smirked, leaning back and putting his feet up on the coffee table again, right on top of a coaster I had hand-carved. At least 3 million, Trayvon estimated, looking at the ceiling. Maybe 4. The old man didn't trust banks, but he definitely trusted interest. We are set for life, Ma. Paige pulled out her phone again, ready to record the moment they became millionaires. Hurry up, she snapped at the lawyer. My battery is dying and I need to capture my genuine reaction for the vlog. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the spreadsheet in front of him. He ran his finger down the column past the dates, past the account numbers, stopping at the final figure at the bottom of the page. Based on the most recent bank statements certified as of this morning, Mr. Sterling began, his voice steady and clear. The total liquidity across all checking and savings accounts under Mr. Silas Benjamin's name is… He paused. The silence stretched out. The wind howled outside, slapping snow against the glass. $42.15. The room froze. It was not a quiet freeze. It was the kind of freeze that happens right before a car crash. The kind where time seems to stop and your brain refuses to process what your ears just heard. Monique blinked. Once. Twice. She tilted her head, a confused smile plastered on her face. I am sorry, she said, letting out a nervous little laugh. I think the storm is messing with my hearing aid. It sounded like you said $42. Mr. Sterling looked up. He did not smile. That is correct, Mrs. Monique. $42.15. To be precise. The smile slid off Monique's face like sludge. She stared at the lawyer. Then she stared at the binder. Then she stared at me. No, she whispered. That is impossible. That is a lie. She lunged for the binder, snatching it off the table with such force that the crystal vase nearby rattled. She frantically scanned the page, her eyes darting back and forth, desperate to find the missing commas, the missing zeros, the missing millions. Where is the rest of it? She screamed, flipping the page over, looking at the back, shaking the binder as if money might fall out of the spine. Where is the retirement fund? Where are the stocks? Where is the offshore account? Silas was a businessman. He owned this mansion. You cannot own a house like this and have $40 in the bank. Mr. Sterling sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap. Mr. Benjamin was a businessman. Yes, the lawyer replied. But businesses fail, Mrs. Monique, and markets crash. As you recall, the economy took a significant downturn a decade ago. Mr. Benjamin's liquid assets were depleted years before he passed. Trayvon stood up slowly. His face had gone from arrogant to pale gray. So, we are broke? He asked, his voice cracking. We just signed for a house, and there is no money to run it. Paige let out a shriek. She dropped her phone. It hit the rug with a dull thud. You are telling me I drove 3 hours in a blizzard for $40, she yelled, turning on Trayvon. You told me he was rich. You told me we were never going to work again. I am rich, Trayvon shouted back, panic rising in his voice. Look at this house. Look at the furniture. We can sell the furniture. That was when the dam broke inside Monique. The shock turned into pure, unadulterated rage. She looked at the empty binder. Then she looked at me, standing in the corner, silent, watching. You, she growled. It was a low, animalistic sound. You did this, she screamed. She grabbed the heavy crystal glass of water from the table and hurled it across the room. It smashed into the wall inches from my head, shattering into 1,000 pieces, water splashing over the wallpaper. You stole it, Monique shrieked, her face turning a violent shade of purple. You have been here for weeks. You got into his accounts. You transferred the money to yourself, didn't you? You thief, you ungrateful little thief. She charged at me. She moved faster than I had ever seen her move. Her hands were clawed, reaching for my hair, reaching for my throat. "Where is the money?" "Jada," she screamed, spit flying from her mouth. "Give it back! Give me my money!" I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I stood my ground. But before she could reach me, a large shadow stepped between us. It was the security guard Mr. Sterling had hired, a man who had been standing silently by the front door this entire time. He caught Monique by the arms, holding her back easily as she thrashed and kicked. "Let me go," she howled. "She stole my inheritance. She is a criminal." I stepped out from behind the guard. I walked up to her, staying just out of reach of her flailing legs. I looked her dead in the eye. "I didn't steal a dime, Monique," I said, my voice cutting through her screams. "Silas didn't have any money. He hasn't had money for 10 years. Liar," she spat. "Then how did he live here? Who paid the heating bill? Who paid for the food? Who paid for the taxes?" I leaned in close. "I did." The screaming stopped. Monique went limp in the guard's grip. She stared at me, her mouth hanging open. What she whispered. "I paid for everything." I repeated, my voice hard and cold. "For 10 years I paid the electric bill so he wouldn't freeze. I paid the grocery bill so he wouldn't starve. I paid for his medication. I paid for the roof repairs. I supported him because he was the only father I ever had." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single crumpled receipt. I held it up. "This is the receipt for the funeral, Monique. $8,000. I paid that too. While you were shopping for a dress to wear to the reading, I was paying to bury your brother." Trayvon sank onto the sofa, putting his head in his hands. "No," he moaned. "This can't be real." "Oh, it is real," I said, turning to look at my brother. "And it gets better. You see, since you just signed that document assuming all assets and responsibilities, you didn't just inherit the $42. I pointed to the red folder on the table. "You also inherited the reality of Silas's life." Monique looked at the red folder. Then she looked at me. The realization was starting to dawn on her, creeping in like the cold from outside. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Sterling stood up again. He opened the red folder. "Mr. Benjamin had no savings," the lawyer explained. "But he did have expenses. Significant expenses. And since the house is not technically an asset he owned," Monique's eyes widened. "Not an asset," she stammered, "but we have the keys." "Possession is not ownership, Mrs. Monique," Mr. Sterling said. "Mr. Benjamin was a tenant, and his lease expired the moment he took his last breath." I watched the color drain from their faces. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. They had come for a feast. They were leaving with a famine. And they had signed their names right on the dotted line. The silence that followed the revelation of the empty bank account was shattered by a sound so shrill it made the crystals on the chandelier tremble. It was Paige. She scrambled backward, knocking over a heavy velvet chair in her haste. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure self-righteous indignation. She pointed a shaking finger at me, her nail polish looking like drops of fresh blood against her pale skin. "She stole it!" Paige screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "It is the only explanation. Look at her. She has been here alone for hours before we arrived. She probably accessed his online banking. She transferred everything to an offshore account." Monique turned to look at me, her eyes wide with a desperate hope. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. Because if I was a thief, then the money still existed. If I was a thief, they could get it back. If I was a thief, they were not fools who had just inherited a mountain of nothing. "That is right," Monique gasped, grasping at the straw Paige offered. "She is a criminal. She has always been a sneak. Remember when she was 10 and stole that candy bar? Once a thief, always a thief." Trayvon stood up, his fists clenched. He looked ready to tear the room apart. "Give it back, Jada," he growled. "Transfer it back right now and maybe we won't press charges." I looked at them. I looked at the 3 people who shared my blood and my name, and I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, No anger, just a profound, heavy exhaustion. I was tired of standing. I was tired of playing the servant. I walked slowly past Trayvon, ignoring his posturing. I walked past Monique, who flinched as if I were going to strike her. I walked straight to the head of the room, to the massive, high-backed leather armchair that had been Uncle Silas's favorite throne. I sat down. The leather creaked as I settled into the cushion. I rested my arms on the armrests and crossed my legs. For the first time all night, I was physically looking down on them. "Call the police," I said. My voice was calm, almost conversational. It was the voice of someone who holds all the aces. Paige blinked, confused by my lack of panic. What she asked. I said, "Call them," I repeated, gesturing to the phone she was clutching in her hand. "Go ahead, dial 911. Tell them there is a thief in the house. Tell them you have been robbed. I will wait." Paige looked at Monique. Monique nodded frantically. "Do it, Paige," Monique yelled. "Call them now. Get this witch arrested." Paige tapped the screen with trembling fingers. She put the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving mine. "Yes, hello. I need police at 45 Kenwood Avenue." "Immediately," Paige shouted into the phone, pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace. "We have a major theft. Millions of dollars. The perpetrator is still on the premises. She is refusing to leave. Yes, we are in danger. Please hurry." She hung up and smirked at me. "They are on their way," she announced triumphantly. "You are going to jail, Jada, and when you are rotting in a cell, we will find where you hid the money." I leaned back in the chair, resting my chin on my hand. I watched the snow swirling against the dark windows. The blue and red lights would be here soon, but we had time. We had just enough time for the truth to finally breathe. "While we wait," I said, turning my gaze to Monique, "let's talk about Silas." "I do not want to talk to you," Monique spat. "I want my money." "You want money that hasn't existed since 2008, I said. The room went quiet again. Even Trayvon stopped pacing. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Uncle Silas was a proud man. I began speaking softly, but clearly. He was a black man, born in the south side of Chicago in the 50s. He built a real estate empire from dirt. He bought this house to prove to the world that he had made it. He loved being the rich uncle. He loved being the man you all envied. I looked at the grand staircase, remembering the days when Silas would walk down it in his silk robe looking like a king. But then the market crashed, I continued. The recession hit him hard. He was over-leveraged. He had too many mortgages and not enough tenants. His buildings emptied out. His stocks plummeted. By the winter of 2009, he had lost almost everything. "Liar," Monique whispered, shaking her head. "He had the Bentley. He had the suits. He leased the Bentley," I corrected her. "And the suits were 20 years old. He kept them pressed and clean so you wouldn't know. He was terrified of you knowing. He was terrified that if the money stopped flowing, the phone calls would stop too." I looked at Monique with pity. And he was right, wasn't he? Monique looked away, unable to hold my gaze. "He went bankrupt," I said. Chapter 7. The banks took everything, the commercial properties, the investment accounts. And eventually, they came for this house. "No," Trayvon argued, pointing at the walls. "We are in the house. He still lived here. He lived here because he was too stubborn to leave," I said, "and because he had help. When the foreclosure notice came, he called me. He didn't call you, Monique. He didn't call his sister. He called the niece he had raised. He sat in this very chair and cried. He told me he was going to be homeless. He told me he was ashamed." I paused, letting the image sink in. The image of the powerful patriarch, broken and weeping. "I had just started my company," I said. "I was young. I didn't have much. But I had enough credit to take a risk. I went to the bank auction. I bought the debt. I bought the deed. I bought this house for pennies on the dollar because nobody else wanted a drafty mansion with a leaking roof in the middle of a recession." Paige let out a scoff of disbelief. You bought this place. You were 22 years old. I was 22 and I was working 18 hours a day." I shot back. While you were maxing out credit cards for handbags, I was building a portfolio. I bought the house under my LLC. I told Silas he could stay here as long as he lived. I told him he didn't have to pay rent. I told him he could pretend it was still his. I stood up and walked over to the fireplace, running my hand along the marble mantel. All I asked in return was that he let me take care of him, I said. And he did. I paid the taxes, I paid the insurance, I paid for the heat so his arthritis wouldn't cripple him, I paid for the nursing care when he got sick. I turned back to face them. My voice rose, fueled by a decade of silence. Where were you? I asked Monique. Where were you when he had his first stroke? Where were you when the bank accounts hit zero? Did you ever call just to say hello? Did you ever visit without asking for a loan? Monique was trembling. Tears were streaming down her face, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or the realization that the money was truly gone. We were busy, she stammered. Trayvon had his music. I had my issues. You were parasites, I said coldly. You sucked him dry when he was rich, and you ignored him when you thought he was boring. You didn't know he was broke because you never looked past his wallet. You saw the address and you assumed the wealth was still there. Trayvon sank onto the sofa, putting his head in his hands. So there is nothing, he asked, his voice muffled. No inheritance. I walked back to the table and picked up the red folder Mr. Sterling had opened. Oh, there is an inheritance, I said. There is a decade of unpaid rent. There is a decade of property taxes that I paid on behalf of the resident. There are maintenance fees. I dropped the folder in front of Trayvon. Uncle Silas insisted on signing a lease with my company. He wanted to maintain his dignity. He signed a contract agreeing to pay $4,000 a month. He never paid a cent. But the debt accrued. It sat on the books, waiting. I looked at Paige, who was staring at the front door, praying for the police to arrive. And since you were so eager to sign that affidavit, I said, since you were so desperate to claim full responsibility for the estate, that debt is now yours. The sound of sirens cut through the storm. Blue and red lights flashed against the living room walls, illuminating the horror on their faces. The police are here, I said, sitting back down in the leather chair. Good, Paige whispered, though she sounded unsure now. She backed away toward the door. Tell them to arrest her. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. I don't think they are here for me, Paige. The heavy knocker banged against the door. Open up. Police Mr. Sterling stood up and buttoned his jacket. He looked at me, then at the family. I advise you to let the officers in, Mrs. Monique, the lawyer said. And I advise you to be very careful about what you say. Filing a false police report is a crime. And attempting to defraud a legitimate creditor? Well, that is a whole other conversation. Monique looked at the door, then at the empty binder, then at me. The reality of the trap was finally closing in. She wasn't just broke. She was in debt to the daughter she had abandoned, and the police she had summoned to save her were about to become the witnesses to her downfall. I crossed my legs and smoothed my skirt. Let them in, I commanded. Trayvon stood up, looking like a zombie, and walked to the door. He pulled it open. 2 officers stood there, snow on their shoulders, hands on their belts. We got a call about a robbery, the older officer asked, looking around the opulent room. Who is the homeowner? Trayvon opened his mouth to speak, to claim his prize, but the words died in his throat. He looked back at me, sitting on the throne. She is, Trayvon whispered, pointing a shaking finger at me. The officer looked at me. I nodded regally. Officer, I said. Thank you for coming. I am afraid there has been a terrible misunderstanding. My guests were just leaving. But since they seem to be confused about the ownership of this property, perhaps you could help them find their way out. Paige let out a scream of frustration. No, she is lying. We signed papers. We own this. She grabbed the binder and shoved it at the officer. Look at the signature. The officer took the binder looking confused. He looked at the paperwork, then at Mr. Sterling. "Sir?" the officer asked. Mr. Sterling stepped forward. "These individuals have indeed signed an assumption of liability for the estate of the late Silas Benjamin," he explained calmly. "However, the estate does not own this property. They are effectively squatters who have just assumed a massive debt, and the actual owner," he gestured to me, "has asked them to vacate." The officer handed the binder back to Paige. He looked at Monique. "Ma'am, if the owner wants you to leave, you have to leave. This is a civil matter regarding the debt, but the trespassing is criminal." Monique looked at me. Her eyes were pleading now. "Jada, please," she begged. "It is snowing. We have nowhere to go." I looked at the window. The snow was falling harder than ever. It was the same kind of snow that had fallen the night I sat on a bench outside the Greyhound station clutching a $10 bill waiting for a mother who never came back. "I know," I said softly. "It is cold out there." I picked up the remote control for the gas fireplace and turned the flames up higher. "You should probably start walking," I said, "before the drifts get too deep." The officer stepped into the room. "All right, folks, let's go. You heard the lady. Move it along." And just like that, the eviction began. The police officers stood by the door, their hands resting on their belts, looking back and forth between the weeping woman on the sofa and the calm woman in the armchair. The energy in the room was frantic, a chaotic mix of desperation and denial. Monique was still sobbing about the empty bank accounts, but I watched Trayvon's eyes. I saw the gears turning in his head. He was a survivor in his own twisted way. He was looking for the exit, looking for the angle, looking for the one thing that could save him from total ruin. He looked up at the high ceilings. He looked at the intricate crown molding. He looked at the vast expanse of the hardwood floor. And then he smiled. It was a shaky, manic smile, but it was there. "Wait," Trayvon said, his voice rising above his mother's cries. "Wait just a damn minute." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stepped into the center of the room, turning his back on the police, turning his back on the debt. He looked at me with a renewed sense of arrogance. "Who cares about the bank account?" Trayvon shouted, spreading his arms wide. "Who cares about $42? Are you all blind? Look around you." He stomped his foot on the floor. "We are standing in a gold mine," he declared. "This is Kenwood. This is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Chicago. This house is massive. It has 6 bedrooms. It has a carriage house. It has historical significance." He turned to Monique, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her. "Ma, listen to me. Stop crying. We don't need Silas's cash. We have the house. Do you know what a place like this goes for? I checked Zillow in the car. Comparable properties are selling for $5 million. $5 million. Monique sniffled, looking up at him with wet, hopeful eyes. $5 million, she whispered. "Yes," Trayvon yelled, laughing now. "We sell it. We sell it tomorrow. We list it as is. Even if we have to pay off some stupid debt, we walk away with $4 million easy. We are still rich. We are still better than her." He turned to me, pointing a finger that was trembling with adrenaline. "You thought you got us, didn't you, Jada? You thought the debt would scare us. But you forgot the asset. We signed the papers." Mr. Sterling said it. "We own the rights to the residence. That means we can sell it." Paige stood up, wiping her mascara-stained cheeks. The greed was creeping back into her face, displacing the fear. "He is right," Paige said, her voice gaining strength. "We have the title, or whatever you called it, the rights. We can liquidate. We can sell the furniture too. That rug alone is worth 20 grand. We are fine. We are totally fine." I looked at them. I looked at their desperate, clawing need to win. They were so confident in their ignorance. They truly believed that the world worked the way they wanted it to work. And then I laughed. It started low in my chest, a rumble of pure amusement. But it grew. It bubbled up until I threw my head back and let it out. A loud, echoing laugh that filled the cavernous room. It bounced off the marble walls. It swirled around the chandelier. It was the laugh of a woman who had held her breath for 20 years and was finally exhaling. Trayvon stopped celebrating. He stared at me. "What is so funny?" he snapped. "You think $5 million is funny? You are just jealous because you didn't think of it." I wiped a tear from my eye, trying to catch my breath. The police officer near the door shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable, but I waved at him to stay put. "Oh, Trayvon," I said, gasping. "You really are precious. You think you can sell this house? I own it," Trayvon screamed. I signed the paper. I looked at Mr. Sterling. The lawyer was polishing his glasses with a silk handkerchief, his face a mask of professional pity. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "please. Before my brother lists a property he doesn't own on Craigslist, would you mind clarifying the legal terminology for him?" Mr. Sterling put his glasses back on. He looked at Trayvon with the kind of patience one uses with a slow child. Mr. Benjamin, the lawyer, said softly, "I am afraid you have fundamentally misunderstood the document you just signed." Trayvon froze. "Misunderstood what you said, rights to the residence." "I said rights of residency," Mr. Sterling corrected him. "And I said tenancy." Trayvon blinked. "That is the same thing." "It is not," Mr. Sterling said firmly. "In the state of Illinois, and indeed in most of the developed world, there is a vast difference between owning a property and leasing it." He opened the red folder again, tapping a specific paragraph with his finger. "Silas Benjamin was a tenant," Mr. Sterling explained. "He had a lease. A very generous lifetime lease, but a lease nonetheless. He did not hold the deed. He did not hold the title. He owned the right to live here and the obligation to maintain it." Trayvon shook his head, backing away. "No," he muttered. "No. That is a lie. He was my uncle. He was rich. He lived here for 30 years. He lived here for 20 years as an owner," Mr. Sterling clarified, "and 10 years as a renter. As Ms. Jada explained, the property was foreclosed upon in 2009. Paige let out a small, strangled sound. She grabbed the edge of the sofa to steady herself. "Foreclosed," she whispered. "Yes," Mr. Sterling said. "The bank took possession. And then the property was purchased at auction by a private holding company. A company called Phoenix Rising LLC. Trayvon looked at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a horror that went beyond money. It was the horror of total emasculation. "Phoenix Rising," he whispered. That is the name of your company." I nodded. "That is right, Trayvon. I bought the house. I bought the mortgage. I own the bricks. I own the land. I own the roof you are standing under. I own the floor you are standing on." I stood up from the chair and walked toward him. He shrank back, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. "So when you signed that paper," I continued, my voice low and hard, "you didn't inherit a $5 million asset. You inherited a standard residential lease agreement, an expired lease agreement." I turned to Paige, who was swaying on her feet. "You cannot sell this house, Paige. You cannot sell the furniture, because you do not own it. You cannot even sell the dust in the corner because legally that dust belongs to me." Paige's legs gave out. She didn't faint, but she collapsed onto the sofa as if her strings had been cut. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. "We are homeless," she choked out. "We are actually homeless." "Not just homeless," I corrected her. "You are homeless and in debt." Monique was sitting frozen, staring at the wall. She was catatonic. The reality was too big for her to process. Her brain had shut down, but Trayvon was still fighting. He was like a cornered rat. "This is a trick," he yelled, pointing at Mr. Sterling. "You tricked us. You used big words. We will sue you. We will get a lawyer, and we will sue you for fraud." Mr. Sterling sighed. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small digital recorder. He placed it on the table. "Mr. Benjamin, I recorded the entire proceeding with your consent, which you gave when you entered the room. I explicitly asked if you wanted to read the documents. Your sister explicitly asked if you were sure you wanted to accept all responsibilities. You said, and I quote, 'I want it all.'" The lawyer looked at the police officers. Gentlemen, you are witnesses to the fact that these individuals signed these documents of their own free will, are you not? The older officer nodded, looked like they were in a hurry to sign, to be honest. The officer grunted. Trevon looked around the room. He looked at the luxury he had tasted for less than an hour. He looked at the life he thought he was owed. It was all smoke. It was all a mirage. So, we get nothing, he whispered. I walked over to the front door and held it open. The wind howled, blowing snow into the foyer. You get exactly what you gave me, I said. I pointed to the darkness outside. You get the cold. Trayvon looked at the open door. Then he looked at his wife weeping on the couch. Then he looked at his mother staring into nothingness. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. The fight had left him. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking gray and sickly. He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed his life away. I am sorry, he whispered. But he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to himself. Get out, I said. And this time, I didn't have to repeat myself. Monique sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands trembling in her lap. The reality of the situation was finally piercing through her delusion. She looked small, defeated, and utterly confused. Her eyes darted around the room, looking at the crown molding the crystal chandelier, the heavy drapes as if seeing them for the first time, not as assets, but as questions. If he was a tenant, Monique whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind howling outside. If Silas did not own this house, then who does? Who have we been stealing from? She looked up at Mr. Sterling, desperation etching deep lines into her forehead. Who is the landlord? She demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. Is it a bank? Is it some faceless corporation? Tell me. Maybe we can negotiate. Maybe we can work out a payment plan. Silas was a good man. Surely they will have mercy on his family. Trayvon nodded, latching onto this new sliver of hope. Yeah, he said, wiping his nose with his sleeve. We can talk to them. We can explain. I am an artist. I have potential earnings. We can cut a deal. I stood by the fireplace watching them grasp at straws. It was pathetic. It was tragic. And it was time to end it. I walked over to my purse, which was sitting on the side table where I had left it hours ago. I reached inside and pulled out a sleek red folder. It was not thick like the binder Mr. Sterling had used. It was thin, precise, dangerous. You want to know who the landlord is? I said, turning to face them. You want to know who holds the deed to 45 Kenwood Avenue? I tossed the red folder onto the coffee table. It landed with a soft slap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Open it, I commanded. Monique stared at the folder as if it were a bomb. She reached out a shaking hand and flipped the cover open. There, at the top of the deed, printed in bold black letters, was the name of the owner. Phoenix Rising, LLC. Monique read aloud, her brow furrowing. What is this? Some investment group? Trayvon froze. His eyes widened and the color drained from his face completely. He knew that name. He had seen it on the return address of the checks I used to send him for his birthday. He had seen it on the letterhead of my office when he came to beg for money 3 years ago. No, Trayvon whispered, backing away. No, it cannot be. Monique looked at him confused. What? What is it, Trayvon? Do you know them? I stepped forward, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. He knows the name Monique, I said, my voice cool and steady. Because he has spent the last 5 years cashing checks from that company. I looked at my mother, holding her gaze until she squirmed. Phoenix Rising LLC is not a bank. It is not a faceless corporation. It is a holding company. And I am the sole proprietor. I own 100% of the shares. Monique gasped, dropping the folder. You, she shrieked. You own this house. I own it all, I said. I own the walls you are staring at. I own the roof over your head. I own the ground beneath your feet. And I have owned it for 10 years. I began to pace slowly around the room, letting the story spill out, letting the truth finally fill the space that their lies had occupied for so long. 10 years ago, Silas called me, I began. It was 2 in the morning. He was crying. Not just crying, Monique. He was sobbing. He was a proud man, a strong man, but he was broken. The recession had destroyed him. The banks had foreclosed on his commercial properties. His stocks were worthless, and he had just received the notice that they were coming for this house. I stopped in front of the window looking out at the snow. He told me he was going to be homeless. He told me he was going to have to move into a shelter. He said he couldn't bear the shame. He said he couldn't bear for you to know. I turned back to face them. He was terrified of you, Monique. He was terrified that if you knew he was broke, you would stop loving him. He knew that your love was conditional. He knew that you only picked up the phone when there was a check attached to it. So he begged me. He begged me to save his dignity. Trayvon shook his head, denial still clinging to him. So what? You just bought a mansion? You were a kid. I was 22, I corrected him. And I had just made my first million liquidating the assets of a failed tech startup. I had the cash. I went to the bank auction the next morning. I outbid 3 developers who wanted to tear this place down and build condos. I bought the deed. I cleared the liens. I walked over to the leather chair where Silas used to sit. I handed the keys back to Silas that same afternoon. I continued. I told him that as long as he was alive, this was his home. I told him he didn't have to pay me a dime. I told him we would keep it a secret. We created a lease agreement just for show, so he could tell people he was handling his estate planning. But the truth was, he was living here on my charity. Monique covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know, she sobbed. I swear I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, I snapped, my voice sharpening. Because you never asked. You never visited him just to sit and talk. You never looked at him and saw a tired old man. You only saw the Bentley. You only saw the suits. You didn't know that I paid for the lease on that Bentley. You didn't know that I paid for the dry cleaning of those suits. You didn't know that the groceries in his fridge, the wine in his cellar, the heat in these vents? I paid for all of it. I pointed a finger at her. For 10 years, Monique, you have been living off me. Every time you came here for Christmas dinner and stuffed your face, you were eating food I bought. Every time Trayvon borrowed $500 from Uncle Silas, he was borrowing my money. I have been supporting this entire family from the shadows while you treated me like the black sheep. I walked closer to them, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I let him keep his pride. I let him play the role of the rich patriarch because it made him happy. But he is gone now. The play is over. The curtain has fallen. And I am done paying for the audience. Paige, who had been silent, suddenly let out a laugh. It was a hysterical, broken sound. So we are broke, she said, staring at the ceiling. We are actually broke. And we owe you money. I looked at the red folder on the table. That is the beauty of it, Paige, I said. You wanted the estate. You wanted the legacy. Well, this is the legacy. Silas left behind a mountain of debt to my company, unpaid rent, unpaid loans, interest. And because you just signed that affidavit, assuming full responsibility, I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Congratulations. You just bought the debt that I forgave him. I was never going to collect from Silas. I loved him. But you, I do not love you, and I will collect every single penny. Monique slumped forward, burying her face in her hands. Trayvon stared at me with a mixture of hatred and awe. They finally understood. They were not just leaving empty-handed. They were leaving in chains. Chains they had forged themselves with their own greed. So tell me, Monique, I asked, leaning down so our faces were level. Who is the landlord now? She didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was too heavy, and she was too weak to carry it. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Paige's breathing. It was ragged and shallow, the sound of a woman who was watching her entire future dissolve into mist. She stared at the red folder on the table, then at me, her eyes darting back and forth as her brain scrambled for a loophole. She had watched enough courtroom dramas to believe she knew more than the lawyers, and now in her desperation she clung to that arrogance like a life raft. Paige stood up slowly, wiping the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. She smoothed her dress, trying to regain some semblance of the superior attitude she had walked in with. "You are lying," Paige spat, her voice trembling but gaining volume. "You are trying to scare us. But I know the law, Jada. I know our rights." She took a step toward Mr. Sterling, pointing a manicured finger at him. "Even if she owns the deed," Paige argued, her voice rising to a shout, "even if Silas was a tenant. We inherited his estate. That means we inherited his lease. And under Illinois law, you cannot just kick out a tenant without due process. We have rights of survivorship. We have the right to occupy this residence until the lease is formally terminated." She turned to me, a triumphant sneer curling her lip. "So you can take your eviction threats and shove them. We are staying. We have a valid claim to this space, and you cannot touch us." Monique looked up, hope flickering in her eyes again. "Is that true?" she asked. "Can we stay?" I looked at Paige. I looked at the defiance in her posture. She really thought she had found the winning move. She thought she had outsmarted me. I nodded slowly, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. "You are absolutely right, Paige," I said. Paige blinked, taken aback by my agreement. "I am?" she asked. "Yes." I continued, walking over to the fireplace and turning to face them. "You are very astute. By inheriting Silas's estate, you have indeed inherited his lease agreement. You have stepped into his shoes. You have all the rights he had as a tenant." Trayvon let out a breath he had been holding. "See?" he said, pointing at me. "I told you. You cannot kick us out. This is our home now." I held up a hand to stop him. "I am not finished," I said. I walked back to the coffee table and picked up the red folder again. I opened it to the very last page. It was a ledger. A long, detailed list of dates and figures that stretched back over a decade. "You inherited the rights," I said, my voice dropping to a serious, heavy tone. "But you forget how contracts work, Paige. You do not just inherit the rights, you inherit the obligations." I placed the ledger in front of Trayvon. "Silas signed a standard lease agreement with Phoenix Rising LLC 10 years ago," I explained. "The rent was set at a very reasonable rate for a property of this size. $3,750 a month, plus property taxes, plus maintenance fees." Monique frowned. "But you said he didn't pay?" she stammered. "You said you let him live here for free." I shook my head. "I said I didn't collect," I corrected her. "There is a difference. I never enforced the payment. I let the invoices pile up. I let the debt accrue on the company books because he was my uncle and I loved him. I chose not to pursue the debt while he was alive." I looked directly at Trayvon. "But Silas never paid a single cent. Not one check. Not one cash transfer. For 120 months the rent went unpaid." I tapped the bottom of the ledger with my finger. "And now that Silas is gone, that debt does not just disappear. It remains attached to his estate. And since you, my dear brother, and you, my loving mother, just signed a legal affidavit accepting full responsibility for all assets and liabilities of the estate." I paused, letting the words hang in the air, like a guillotine blade. "Congratulations," I whispered. "You didn't just inherit a lease. You inherited the bill." Trayvon looked down at the paper. His eyes scanned the columns of numbers, the interest calculations, the late fees that had been legally applied but never collected. His mouth moved silently as he tried to process the final figure. "How much?" Paige whispered. Her voice was barely a squeak. "I didn't make them do the math. I gave it to them straight. The total outstanding balance for unpaid rent taxes and maintenance over the last 10 years is $450,000, I announced. Monique let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. She clutched her chest as if she were having a heart attack. $450,000, she gasped. "And counting," I added. I picked up the affidavit they had signed just minutes ago. The ink was barely dry. I held it up for them to see their jagged, greedy signatures staring back at them. You wanted it all, remember? I asked, my voice hard. You said you wanted every atom. You wanted the bacteria. Well, this is the price of admission. You are now personally liable for nearly $500,000 payable to Phoenix Rising LLC. Paige shook her head frantically, backing away toward the door. No, she cried. No, that is not fair. We didn't know. We thought we were getting money. You tricked us. I didn't trick you, Paige, I said, taking a step toward her. I asked you to read the documents. Mr. Sterling asked you if you were sure. I asked you if you wanted everything, even the things you couldn't see. You were so blinded by greed, so desperate to take what you didn't earn, that you signed your life away without a second thought. Traven slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. We don't have that kind of money, he moaned. You know we don't. I have $40 in my pocket. Then I guess you have a problem, I said. Because as the creditor, I have options. I can garnish your wages. I can put a lien on any other assets you might have, though I suspect those are non-existent. Or... I looked around the room, letting my gaze linger on the luxury they had tried to claim. Or, I can evict you for non-payment of rent. Immediately. Paige looked up, her face streaked with mascara. But the lease, she whimpered. The lease is in default, I said sharply. It has been in default for 10 years. The only reason no one was kicked out was because I allowed it. But my patience has run out. You are squatters in a property you cannot afford, owing a debt you cannot pay to a landlord you have treated like garbage for 20 years. I turned to Mr. Sterling. Execute the eviction notice, I commanded, and file the judgment for the debt against Monique and Trayvon Benjamin first thing Monday morning. I want it on their credit reports by noon. Mr. Sterling nodded, pulling a pre-printed document from his briefcase. He handed it to Trayvon. This is your notice to vacate, Mr. Sterling said. Effective immediately. Trayvon stared at the paper in his hand. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a deed. It was the end of his life as he knew it. You are ruining us, he whispered, looking up at me with wet red eyes. You are my sister. How can you do this? I looked at him. I looked at the man who had laughed when I was kicked out at 12. I looked at the man who had planned to destroy Uncle Silas's library to build a rap studio. I looked at the man who had treated me like a servant in my own house. I am not ruining you, Trayvon, I said. I am just giving you the bill for the life you tried to steal. I walked over to the door and pulled it open wide. The snow was piling up on the porch, a wall of white silence. Now get out of my house, before I start charging you for the next month's rent. Monique stood up, her legs shaking. She looked at me one last time. There was no anger left in her eyes, only fear. She realized finally that she had created a monster, and that monster had just come home to eat. Come on, she whispered to Trayvon. Come on, we have to go. They gathered their wet coats. They grabbed their cheap suitcases. They didn't look at the art on the walls. They didn't look at the chandelier. They just looked at the floor heads, bowed, defeated by their own signatures. As they walked past me into the cold, bitter night, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt clean. The debt was called in, the ledger was balanced, and the house was finally quiet. The realization that they were not millionaires but rather debtors hit my mother like a physical blow. Or at least that was the performance she decided to give. As the weight of the $450,000 debt settled over the room, Monique's eyes rolled back in her head. She let out a soft, theatrical gasp, pressed her hand to her forehead, and crumbled. It was a slow, controlled descent. She made sure to land on the thickest part of the Persian rug, and she made sure her dress was fanned out dramatically around her. She lay there perfectly still, waiting for the sympathy that always came. She was waiting for me to rush to her side, to apologize, to tear up the contract, and beg for her forgiveness. She was waiting for the world to stop because she was uncomfortable. But the world did not stop, and I did not move. I stood by the fireplace looking down at her with the same expression one might use when inspecting a stain on the carpet. She is faking, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. She didn't hit her head. Her breathing is even. She is just trying to reset the scene because she doesn't like the script. Trayvon, however, did not care if it was a performance or not. Seeing his mother on the floor was the spark that ignited the powder keg of his humiliation. He looked at her, then he looked at me. His eyes were red-veined with stress and fury. The reality of his failure, the loss of the house, the crushing debt, it all boiled down to one target: me. "You did this!" Trayvon screamed, his voice cracking into a primal roar. "You killed her. You killed my mother." He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just snapped. He lowered his shoulder and charged across the room, aiming directly for me. His fists were clenched, ready to strike, ready to beat the money out of me if he had to. Paige screamed. Mr. Sterling shouted a warning. But I didn't flinch. I didn't have to. Before Trayvon could get within 5 feet of me, a massive figure stepped out from the shadows near the entryway. It was the head of the private security team. I had hired, a man named Marcus, who was built like a linebacker and had been silent as a statue all night. Marcus moved with terrifying speed. He intercepted Trayvon mid-stride, grabbing him by the collar of his cheap suit and slamming him backward. Trayvon flew through the air and crashed onto the coffee table, shattering the glass surface and sending the red folder sliding across the floor. "Stay down," Marcus barked, his voice booming like thunder. The 2 police officers who had been watching the scene unfold with growing concern stepped forward, hands on their holsters. They didn't arrest Trayvon, but they stood over him, making it clear that any further movement would result in handcuffs. Trayvon lay amidst the shards of glass, gasping for air, the wind knocked out of him. He looked up at me, defeated, broken and bleeding slightly from a cut on his cheek. I walked over to him, the sound of my heels crunching on the broken glass. I looked down at my brother, the golden child, the boy who had been given everything and had turned it into nothing. "That was a mistake, Trayvon," I said softly. "Assaulting the landlord is a violation of the lease terms. It is also a felony. But I am not going to press charges for that. Not yet." I turned to Mr. Sterling. "Is the asset seizure clause enforceable immediately?" I asked. Mr. Sterling nodded, stepping around Monique's motionless body. "Yes, Ms. Jada. Under the terms of the original lease and reaffirmed by the affidavit, they just signed, the landlord reserves the right to distress and distraint. This means that in the event of default, the landlord may seize personal property found on the premises to offset the outstanding debt." He handed me a clipboard with an inventory list. "Since they have admitted to having no cash liquidity," the lawyer continued, looking at the family with cold professionalism, "you are within your rights to liquidate their physical assets to recover a portion of the arrears." I took the clipboard. I smiled. Trayvon tried to sit up. "What? What does that mean?" "It means," I said, looking at the pile of luggage they had dragged in from the storm, "it means you are not leaving with what you came with." I pointed to the security team. "Confiscate everything I ordered." Marcus and his team moved instantly. They grabbed the Louis Vuitton suitcases. They grabbed the designer handbags Paige had thrown on the sofa. They grabbed the fur coat Monique had worn. "Hey," Paige screamed, lunging for her bag. "You cannot take that. My laptop is in there. My jewelry is in there. That is my personal property. It is collateral now," I said, watching the guard pull the bag out of her reach. "You owe me $450,000, Paige." That bag might cover about $50 of interest. At the sound of zippers opening and bags being moved, the miracle occurred. Monique, who had been comatose on the floor a moment ago, suddenly gasped and sat bolt upright. The cure for her fainting spell was apparently the sound of her assets being touched. "Get your hands off my things!" Monique shrieked, scrambling to her feet with surprising agility. "That is my jewelry. That is my grandmother's ring." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. "No, Monique. That ring belongs to the estate, and the estate belongs to the debt." I walked over to her. She was clutching a small, velvet pouch she had pulled from her pocket, trying to hide it. I held out my hand. "Give it to me," I said. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face for real this time. Please, Jada, she begged. Not the ring. It is all I have left. You have your son, I said. You have your daughter-in-law. You have the family you chose. Isn't that enough? Isn't that what you always told me? That family is everything. I snapped my fingers. The ring. Now. Or I add theft to the police report. Trembling, Monique dropped the pouch into my hand. I didn't even look inside. I handed it to Mr. Sterling to catalog. I turned back to the room. The security team had stripped them of their luggage, their coats, and their dignity. They were standing there in their indoor clothes, shivering, surrounded by the opulence they could not touch. But there was one more thing, the crown jewel of Trayvon's ego. I walked to the window and pulled back the heavy drape. Outside, parked haphazardly in the driveway, covered in a layer of fresh snow, was a black Range Rover. It was brand new. I knew for a fact that Trayvon had leased it 2 weeks ago, using the anticipation of this inheritance as collateral. I turned to Trayvon. He was still on the floor nursing his bleeding cheek. The keys, I said. Trayvon froze. He clutched his pocket. No, he whispered. Not the car. I need the car to get home. We cannot walk in this storm. You should have thought about that before you tried to assault me, I said. I looked at the police officer. Officer, that vehicle is parked on private property owned by Phoenix Rising LLC. The owner of the vehicle owes the company a substantial debt. I am exercising my right to impound the vehicle as collateral until the debt is settled. The officer shrugged. Civil matter, ma'am. If he signed the paper, he signed the paper. I held out my hand to Trayvon. Keys, I repeated. Trayvon looked at Paige. She was sobbing into her hands. He looked at Monique. She was staring at the floor, defeated. He realized he had no allies left. He realized that for the first time in his life, his charm, his mother's protection, and his lies could not save him. Slowly, painfully, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the heavy electronic key fob. He stared at it for a long moment, as if saying goodbye to the last shred of his manhood. Then he dropped it into my palm. I closed my fingers around the warm plastic. Thank you, I said. We will apply the Blue Book value of the vehicle to your balance. I suspect it will cover maybe 3 months of the back rent. You still have 9 years and 9 months to go. I tossed the keys to Marcus. Pull it into the garage, I said. It is snowing and I don't want my new asset to rust. I looked at my family. They were stripped bare. No bags, no coats, no car, no money. They were exactly as I had been 20 years ago. Helpless, cold, and alone. The door is that way, I said, pointing to the exit. Trayvon stood up shakily. How are we supposed to get home? He asked, his voice broken. I walked over to the side table and picked up a small pile of cash. It was $10, a single crisp $10 bill. I walked up to Monique and pressed it into her hand. Here, I said. Monique looked at the bill confused. What is this? She asked. It is $10, I said. It is exactly what you gave me when you dropped me off at the Greyhound station. You said it was enough for a ticket to wherever. I leaned in close, whispering in her ear. You are generous, remember? You are a saint. So take this $10 and go. Monique stared at the money. Then she stared at me. The realization of the symmetry, the poetic justice of it crushed her. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. She turned around, signaling to Trayvon and Paige. Let's go, she whispered. They walked toward the door. The security guards stepped aside to let them pass. The police officers watched them go. As Trayvon opened the heavy oak door, the wind howled, blowing a gust of snow into the foyer. They stepped out into the blizzard, 3 silhouettes disappearing into the white void. I watched them go. I watched until the door clicked shut, sealing out the cold, sealing out the past. I turned back to the room. It was quiet. It was warm. I looked at Mr. Sterling. Inventory complete, I asked. He smiled, closing his ledger. Complete Ms. Jada. I walked over to the fireplace and warmed my hands. I had lost a family I never really had, but I had reclaimed my home. And for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like victory. The wind roared through the open doorway, a ravenous beast demanding to be fed. My family stood on the precipice of the storm, shivering in their indoor clothes, stripped of their furs, their bags, and their pride. For a moment, it seemed like they would simply walk out and accept their fate. But greed is a stubborn addiction, and the withdrawal was hitting them hard. Paige was the first to snap. She looked at the wall of white snow, then back at the warm golden light of the foyer. The reality of walking into a blizzard in high heels was too much for her entitled mind to process. She dug her heels into the marble floor, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "No, Paige," screamed, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "I am not going out there. You cannot make me. This is inhumane." She lunged for the doorframe, gripping the wood with her manicured claws. "Officer!" she yelled at the policeman who was trying to guide her out. "You cannot do this. I will sue you. I will sue this entire department. Do you know who my father is? He is a dentist in Naperville. He will have your badge." The officer, a seasoned veteran who had clearly seen far worse than the tantrums of a spoiled suburbanite, simply sighed and peeled her fingers off the wood one by one. "Ma'am, you are trespassing," the officer said, his voice flat. "You have been asked to leave. Now you can walk out or I can carry you out, but either way you are going." "I am not trespassing," Paige shrieked, kicking her legs as the officer took her by the arm. "I am a victim. She is the criminal. Look at her. She is standing there laughing at us." I wasn't laughing. I was watching. I was witnessing the final tantrum of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. It was grotesque, and yet I couldn't look away. Trayvon, meanwhile, had not moved toward the door. He was staring at the keys to the Range Rover that Marcus was holding. He watched as the security guard turned and walked toward the garage, taking the last symbol of his manhood with him. The loss broke him. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It was the car. The car was how he showed the world he mattered. Without it, he was just a 30-year-old man with no job and a mountain of debt. He let out a wail that sounded like a wounded animal. "No," Trayvon cried, dropping to his knees. "Not the car. Please, Jada. Not the car." He scrambled across the floor, ignoring the broken glass that bit into his knees. He crawled toward me, tears streaming down his face, snot running from his nose. He looked pathetic. He looked small. "Chioi," he sobbed, reverting to the childhood nickname he hadn't used in 20 years. "Sister, please. I am your brother. I am your flesh and blood. You cannot do this to me." He reached out and grabbed the hem of my pants, burying his face in the fabric. "I am sorry," he wept. "I am so sorry. I was stupid. I was wrong. Just let me keep the car. Let us stay in the carriage house. I will work for you. I will shovel the snow. Anything. Just don't throw us out." The room went silent, save for Paige's distant screaming and Trayvon's sobbing. Monique stood by the door, clutching the $10 bill I had given her, looking at her son with dull, empty eyes. She didn't move to help him. She didn't have the strength. I looked down at the top of Trayvon's head. I remembered the day I left. I remembered him standing in the window eating a chocolate bar, watching me drag my garbage bag down the driveway. He hadn't cried then. He hadn't begged Monique to let me stay. He had waved. I leaned down slowly. I placed my hand on his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. He thought I was breaking. He thought the big sister instinct was finally kicking in. "Jada," he whispered. I leaned closer, bringing my lips right to his ear so only he could hear me. "Do you remember the day I left?" I whispered. Trayvon blinked, confused. "What do you remember the $10 Mom gave me?" I asked. "Do you remember what she said? She said it was enough to get me out of her life." Trayvon's lip trembled. I I remember. I smiled. It was a gentle smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. Well, I whispered, I left $10 on the hall table for you. Ask your mother. It is enough for a bus ticket. Trevon pulled back, staring at me as if I had slapped him. Bus ticket? He stammered. Yes, I said, standing up and brushing his hands off my leg. You took my room. You took my childhood. Now you can take the bus. I looked at him one last time. We are even, little brother. I signaled to the second officer. Get him out. The officer stepped forward and hoisted Trevon to his feet. Trevon went limp, his legs refusing to support him. He was dragged across the marble floor, his expensive Italian loafers, which he had forgotten to take off, leaving scuff marks that I would have to buff out later. Paige was already outside, standing in the snow, screaming at the sky. Monique walked out like a ghost, her head bowed against the wind. And finally, Trevon was shoved out into the night. The wind howled one last time, sending a flurry of snowflakes into the foyer, as if trying to invade my sanctuary. But I was ready. Close it, I said to Marcus. The security guard nodded. He pushed the heavy oak double doors shut. The latch clicked into place with a sound that was solid, final, and incredibly satisfying. The sound of the wind was instantly cut off. The screaming was silenced. The cold was locked out. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm orange glow over the room. The chandelier sparkled above, unbothered by the drama that had just unfolded beneath it. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door. I waited for the guilt to come. I waited for that familiar pang of shame, the voice in my head that said, I was a bad daughter, a bad sister, a bad person. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in decades. It was as if a heavy stone had been lifted from my heart. The house was quiet, not the empty, lonely silence of before, but a peaceful, cleansed silence. The air felt lighter. The shadows felt less oppressive. Mr. Sterling walked over to the side table. The pop of a cork echoed in the quiet room. He poured 2 glasses of the vintage Bordeaux that Silas had been saving for a special occasion. He walked over to me and held out a glass. For the record, Miss Jada, Mr. Sterling said, his voice warm and filled with respect. That was the most legally sound eviction I have ever witnessed. I took the glass, swirling the dark red liquid. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I walked over to the fireplace. The flames were dancing, hungry and bright. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled copy of the will, the one Monique had been clutching earlier, the one she thought was her ticket to paradise. I looked at the paper. I looked at the names. Monique, Trevon, the people who were supposed to love me. I tossed the paper into the fire. The edges curled and blackened. The fire consumed the words. It consumed the rights, the entitlements, and the expectations. It turned their greed into ash and smoke, rising up the chimney and disappearing into the night. Mr. Sterling raised his glass. To Silas, he said softly. I clinked my glass against his. The crystal rang out like a bell. To Silas, I repeated, and to new beginnings. I took a sip of the wine. It was rich, complex, and tasted like freedom. I walked over to the large bay window that overlooked the driveway. Through the glass, I could see the faint taillights of a taxi disappearing down the street. They were gone. They were really gone. I turned back to the room, my house, my life. I was Jada Benjamin. I was the girl who was thrown away. I was the girl who was told she was worthless. I was the girl who was told she was a curse. But as I stood there, bathed in the warmth of the fire, holding a glass of wine in a mansion I had bought with my own sweat and tears, I knew the truth. I wasn't the curse. I was the cure. And I had finally cut out the cancer that had been killing this family for years. I took another sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through my body. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the world in white. But inside, everything was perfect. I was home, Jada's story serves as a stark reminder that greed is a blinding force capable of obscuring the truth until it is too late. Monique and Trayvon were so consumed by the entitlement of inheritance that they failed to recognize the true source of the family's stability. It teaches us that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and silence should never be mistaken for weakness. True wealth is not found in possessions or titles, but in integrity and self-reliance. Ultimately, you cannot build a future on a foundation of arrogance without eventually paying the steep price for the past. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace and dignity? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about resilience and justice.